source water and finished water. And then Maria, I'll hand it back over to Maria, and she'll talk about the implementation of the PFAS Protection Act. If you haven't heard of that already, you will find out what that is later, which includes kind of the timeline, development of what we're calling PFAS action plans, as well as policy recommendations that West Virginia Rivers and other partners are putting forth. And then ending with kind of our community engagement plan and how you can get involved in addressing this issue in West Virginia. Then, as Sonia said, we'll end with questions and are enjoying, hopefully will lead to a discussion that is between you and I and Maria. We don't want to be talking at you, but we really want this to be a two-way conversation and incorporate as much as your knowledge and information and questions that you have as much as possible. So that being said, what are PFAS? So PFAS have been in the media quite a bit over the past couple of years. I'm sure many of you are familiar with many of the things on the slide, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a very large group. Over 10,000 different types of PFAS are in this bubble of PFAS. They're man-made chemicals that have been around since like the mid-20th century, and they are known for having very strong carbon to fluorine bonds. So essentially what makes a PFAS is that linked carbon and fluorine atom chain, which you can see down here. So this is a picture of perfluorooctanoic acid, otherwise known as PFOA. So you can see this linked carbon chain in the middle, which is saturated by fluorine atoms on the outside. And that carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. And so that's what makes these chemicals so useful and also dangerous. So that's why they have the name forever chemicals, because they rarely break down in natural conditions. However, because of that, they also are really useful for manufacturing processes and also in our products. So they've been used since the mid-20th century for their non-stick, stain-resistant, heat-resistant, and water-resistant properties. So a couple of examples of products with PFAS are listed in the bottom of the slide. Non-stick cookware, right? Those like Teflon frying pans, also firefighting foam, carpet, Scotch guard, materials like that. And also in food packaging, we can have like microwave popcorn bags. Those are some common kind of household items that PFAS are using. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about PFAS sources, and this is quite an involved graphic, but I'm going to try to go slow and we'll all be on the same page by the end. So talking through PFAS sources and how they get introduced into our air and our water and animals and humans as well, right? So starting with industry. So like I said, PFAS are used in almost nearly every industrial process and used in many, many consumer products. So industries that are either producing PFAS or using PFAS in their processes are going to discharge, right, some of their wastewater, and they're going to discharge that wastewater typically directly into surface water. So that's one way that PFAS are introduced into water. They may also have air emissions. So that's another way that PFAS can be introduced into the air. And then if they're making PFAS to then be used for PFAS products, then those products are going to make their way into households as well. And sometimes industry has solid waste that they dispose of as well. And so that solid waste can go into landfills. And industries also sometimes discharge liquid waste and they send it to wastewater treatment plants. So that's kind of broad category of industry. So then if we take a look at landfills, inputs of PFAS into landfills, right, include sometimes some solid waste from industry. It also includes all of our household waste, which of many of those PFAS products that I just described on the previous slide are in that household waste. And also wastewater treatment plants. The solids that are removed during the treatment process are known as sludge, and sometimes sludge is then buried in sanitary landfills as well. So those are the inputs to the landfills of PFAS, and then PFAS can also be released from landfills in the leachate, which is the contaminated liquid from landfills. It could be leaking because the lining isn't working properly, or sometimes leachate is purposefully given to wastewater treatment plants so it can go through treatment processes before it's discharged. So that's landfills, source of landfills. The next source we're going to talk about here is this wastewater treatment plant. So if we look at inputs, again, of PFAS for wastewater treatment plants, sewage, so household sewage, right, that's coming from our households. And then also we have inputs, like I mentioned, from the landfill and also possibly from industry. So wastewater treatment plants as of today and these days typically don't have treatment processes that remove PFAS. So they're going to go through their normal treatment processes, but the treated water is still going to contain PFAS when it's then discharged into either surface water or groundwater. Another release of PFAS from wastewater treatment plants can be in the form of biosolids. So that's going to be the solids that are extracted from the wastewater treatment processes. They need to meet a required set of standards to be land applied, and sometimes they're land applied to farms. And so that's another way that PFAS are released from wastewater treatment plants into other potential sources. So if we talk about farms for a second, inputs of PFAS into farms could include those PFAS contaminated biosolids that I just discussed. Also, if the surface water and the water that's used to irrigate the produce that's growing on the farm is PFAS contaminated, particularly if the produce has a very high water content like tomatoes or blueberries, then the plants can uptake the PFAS as well. So the PFAS can be introduced into farm staff as well. And so then releases of PFAS from farms include food. So right, if it is a high water content produce that this farm is producing, then that food is going to make its way into the food supply. And also, if biosolids are land applied and livestock are grazing on that land, then it's possible that both the dairy products from those livestock and the meat can be contaminated as well. And so that's another way that it could make its way into the food supply. And then also runoff from biosolids into surface water. Well, so switching gears a little bit, we're going to come over to firefighting foam for a second. You guys have probably heard of AFFF, aqueous film forming foam. So they're used for flammable liquid-based fires and most commonly associated with military bases or airports or firefighting training centers, things like that. And so PFAS are used in those AFFF foams, and they can make their way into the groundwater and also run off into surface water. And so then our last kind of source here is residential homes, right? So if we have PFAS in our water, either our surface water or our groundwater, and those are our drinking water supplies, then it's going to make its way into our drinking water. And we could be ingesting that in our homes, as well as the food that I described earlier, and then also all of those products that we're using that contain PFAS. And so we are disposing of those products, again, in our trash, which is then going into a landfill, and also PFAS that we might be excreting into our toilet that is going to make its way into the wastewater treatment plant. So that was a lot. But really, I say all of that to show that this is a very complex issue. And this also, once PFAS is kind of introduced into this system, it really cycles between all of these various sources. So we like to say sometimes that we need to kind of stop the PFAS cycle. And you'll hear us say throughout this presentation too, the importance of reducing and eliminating PFAS at the source. And so this is why, because once it's introduced, really it just kind of cycles between all the sources. All right. So this is a map that's from the Environmental Working Group, and it's displaying known contamination of PFAS across the United States in either drinking water or military sites or usually industrial sites. That's what the other known sites is referring to. And this is just to show the widespread prevalence of PFAS contamination across the United States. So these data are being pulled from tests that public water systems have done and reported on. It's being pulled from EPA data. It's also being pulled from Department of Defense reports. So this is just to show the widespread issue that PFAS are in our drinking water across the United States. And if it's in our drinking water, it's in our drinking water supplies, right? Our rivers and our streams and our lakes, and it's also in our fish. So this is another map. All of the maps that I'm going to show you are interactive online maps that you can go to yourself and kind of poke around and play with later. So happy to provide those links for y'all after the presentation. So this is PFAS in freshwater fish across the United States. Again, this is drawing from EPA's fish monitoring data put together by the Environmental Working Group. And so 1 dot is a composite sample ranging from 1 to 10 samples of the same fish species in the same location. And you can see again that similar to drinking water contamination, that there's PFAS in freshwater fish all across the country. And a recent study suggested something pretty alarming. In addition to kind of providing further evidence for the widespread contamination of freshwater fish across the country, they also suggested that 1 single serving of freshwater fish in 1 year is equal to drinking water that has 12 times EPA's proposed drinking water standard for just 1 month. So I'm going to say it one more time because it's kind of loud. So 1 single serving of freshwater fish in a whole year can be equal to drinking water that's 12 times the proposed standard for just 1 month. So it's a pretty significant potential exposure pathway, especially when you think about it in relation to drinking water.
Can you kind of show us where we are on the map, generally?
Will you be over here?
Oh, right in front.
Yeah. And like I said, yeah, if you want to kind of like go and click around and be like, oh, where's this point? Where's that point? Which fish are we talking about here? You can do that offline. These are all interactive maps. Okay, so it's in the water, it's in the fish. We are moving up the food chain a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about birds. I figured since it's an Audubon talk, we should probably do something about birds. Something about birds, yeah. So PFOS is a particular type of PFAS. It's a PFAS that is most common in freshwater fish. It makes sense then that it's also most common and the most studied PFAS in birds as well. A lot of these studies are referring to aquatic birds, right? Like cormorants or other birds that would be ingesting fish. And so each of these circles is a study, and there's 2 types of information displayed in the circle. There's the size, right? So that's going to be your sample size for that study. And then there's also the color. So that the color is referring to the mean PFOS concentration. Near 0 is going to be green, and then the highest concentration, 1,395, I believe it's parts per trillion, are going to be your highest concentration. So this is based on review from the Bonasali Al-Quadi lab that's based in California, the California State Polytechnic University in Pomora. And they did a review basically on all of the research that's been published to date that has measured PFOS in birds' liver, blood, or eggs. And they produced this, again, interactive map. You can go online, you can check out all that stuff too. So basically what I'm just saying this map for is to show that not only is this a nationwide problem, but it's also a global issue. And PFAS have been found in areas as remote and seemingly untouched as the Arctic, snow in the Arctic. And just because there's very few circles in South America and Africa and some of the Asian countries does not mean that there's no PFOS in birds there. Rather, it suggests that the research is mainly done in the North America, Europe, and this part of Asia over there. So we know it's in the water, we know it's in the fish, we know it's in the birds. How does it get into humans? So talking through a couple of the main human exposure pathways, those are diet, water, and indoor air and dust. So diet and water are really the 2 big ones. If you are being exposed to PFAS, it's likely through what you're eating and also through what you're drinking. And the relative contribution of those pathways is very dependent on localized conditions and like where you live, right? So if you're a community where your drinking water is contaminated with PFAS, then water might be a larger contributor than diet. But if you live in a community where your water is not contaminated with PFAS, then maybe diet is the larger contributor than water. So I talked through those examples when we were on the PFAS sources slide, and drinking water, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. So just a little bit about indoor air and dust. This contribution is relatively small compared to exposure through water and through diet. And really, it's because there's so many PFAS products in our homes, and our homes don't have very good air ventilation. And so when you think about maybe if you sprayed like Scotch Guard on your sofa, or all those waterproof jackets that you're using, just tiny particles, right, that we can't see can get into the air and into the dust that settles in our homes. And so just exposure through breathing indoor air and dust is one much smaller pathway for human exposure, but still a measurable pathway for human exposure. So then that begs the question, what are the health effects, right, of that exposure? So this is a study, or this is a review, and the study that was published in 2021. And so effects from PFAS exposure to humans, you can see that there's high certainty and lower certainty ones here. So PFAS exposure can lead to thyroid disease, increased cholesterol levels, liver damage, kidney cancer, testicular cancer in men, and it can also have developmental effects while in the womb as well. So some of those listed here are delayed mammary gland development, reduced response to vaccines, as well as lower birth weight. So those are the human health effects, which then begs the question, okay, at what levels are we talking about where some of these effects might be something I need to think about, where some of these negative and adverse health effects might occur at very low levels. So I'm gonna clarify here that we're talking about drinking water. The next couple slides are all gonna be about drinking water. And this slide in particular, we're gonna go over some of the EPA's health advisories and proposed drinking water standards for two specific PFAS. The two PFAS we're talking about here are PFOA and PFOS. Those are the most studied PFAS. And EPA in 2022 published an interim health advisory. For PFOA, it was 0.004 parts per trillion. For PFOS, it was 0.02 parts per trillion. And this health advisory is the concentration in drinking water at or below which adverse health effects are not expected to occur. Very EPA language. And to just give you a scale of what a part per trillion is, because that's very vague unless you work in a laboratory all the time. 1 part per trillion is equivalent to a single drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And we're talking about much, much less than 1 part per trillion. So these two in particular, PFOA and PFOS, are toxic at very, very low, near zero levels. All right, the thing about the health advisory though is that PFAS can't be measured at levels that are that low. They can't be measured as low as less than 1 part per trillion. So that is based on the best available science and lifetime exposure. And if we could measure that low, then that would be great, but our detection limit for these analytical methods do not allow us to measure that low. So then EPA last year in 2023 in March, they released what's called a maximum contaminant level. And how that process works, there's kind of two parts. First, they release a maximum contaminant level goal, or they think about a maximum contaminant level goal, which is solely taking into consideration public health. So if we're only thinking about public health and we're not thinking about analytical detection limits, we're not thinking about treatment technologies, we're not thinking about economic feasibility, then we would want to have 0 PFOA and 0 PFOS in our drinking water. However, that's the reality. And so EPA starts with the goal and they say, okay, we're going to try to put this maximum contaminant level as close as possible to the goal. And then they go from there. I will also mention that these two PFAS are known carcinogens, and when a chemical is a known carcinogen, then EPA will set the maximum contaminant level goal at 0. So moving from the goal and taking into consideration all those things I listed before. So detection limits and economic feasibility and treatment technology efficiency, EPA proposed that the maximum contaminant level for PFOA and PFOS is 4 parts per trillion. So that means that that is the maximum allowable concentration in drinking water that can then be distributed to customers of public water systems. Okay, that was a lot. We're going to reference these later. That's why I talked through them so much, because we're going to talk about, well, what's been done in West Virginia, and then we're going to kind of compare them to these standards. So I really want you all to understand what these standards are and the differences between these. Okay. So we talked about the maximum contaminant levels. I only went over two. EPA proposed a maximum contaminant levels for 6 PFAS. So we've gone over PFOA and PFOS. Those were 4 parts per trillion. But they also proposed a hazard index to cover 4 other PFAS that are listed here: Gen X, PFBS, PFNA, and PFHXS. And how they calculate that hazard index is shown over here in this infographic. So if you're a water system and you are trying to figure out whether you are in accordance with the Safe Water Drinking Act, this is how you do it. You're going to measure how much Gen X is in your treated water, and then you're going to divide it by health-based water concentrations. So the health-based water concentrations are similar to those health advisories, in which those are the concentrations in drinking water at or below which health effects are unlikely to occur. So you take those 4, Gen X, PFBS, PFNA, PFHXS, divide them by their health-based water concentration, and then you are going to sum all of those fractions. And then if your summation is greater than 1, then that's a violation of this MCL. If it's less than 1, then you're within the MCL. Okay, so now those were all the kind of comparative standards that we needed to understand to then talk about and interpret the results of what's actually been sampled in West Virginia. So back in 2020, I believe, yeah, there was Senate Concurrent Resolution 46 that was passed, and that said that the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Health and Human Resources, in partnership with the United States Geological Survey, USGS, we're going to sample the source water for public water systems across the state. So that was this publication right here that came out in 2022 and showed that of the 279 public water systems source water that was sampled, so pre-treated water, there were 130 of them that had PFOA or PFOS at levels that exceeded that health advisory. If you remember, I talked about the health advisory, how it was near 0. Okay, exceeded that one. So which was very concerning. So 130 of our water systems across the state, that serves about 700,000 West Virginians, right, are being exposed to concentrations that we know can cause adverse health effects. So if we zoom in a little bit to the Eastern Panhandle, this is a list of the water systems that had concentrations of PFAS over those health advisory levels. And then we just pulled out a couple of them specifically here. So South Jefferson Elementary, for example, had 4.5 parts per trillion of PFOA, 6.2 parts per trillion of PFOS. The Department of Veterans Affairs, 5.1 of PFOA, and 55, a shockingly high 55 parts per trillion of PFOS. And then Harpers Ferry had 2.5 parts per trillion of PFOA. So I will note here, if we remember back to that table, right, the health advisories are near 0, and then there was that proposed MCL of 4. So while South Jefferson Elementary and the Department of Veterans Affairs would exceed that MCL, so when it comes and is finalized, that would be a violation. Harpers Ferry would not, right, because it's under 4. So technically they will be abiding by the Safe Water Drinking Act. But this is in source water. That's another caveat. This is source water. I'll talk about finished water in a second. If we were to extend and assume that the concentrations would be similar to source water and finished water, that's what we might expect. So in conclusion of that source water study that showed that PFAS contamination is prevalent in our drinking water supplies, again, DEP, DHHR, and USGS partnered up, and they are completing an ongoing study to sample PFAS in the finished water, right? So that's going to be the treated water for all of those water systems. Of the 130, they've done 37 so far, and this map is showing this is a DHHR map. It's not the best map, but it's okay. It's showing which water systems they've tested so far. So the ones that are filled, little water droplets that are filled in blue have been tested. The ones where it's just the outline have not been tested yet. And again, this is an interactive map that's on the West Virginia DHHR website. If you want to go and click around and kind of find what's close to you, you can definitely do that. But for an example, if you plan to do that, let's zoom in a little bit here. And let's look at South Jefferson Elementary. So previously we were talking about their source water results, and now we're looking at the finished water results for PFAS testing. So we take it one by one. PFOA was 3.64 nanograms per liter, and parts per trillion are equivalent, just to let everyone know. So we're looking at parts per trillion, also known as nanograms per liter. So this is under that 4 limit. That's great. PFOS is 7.81. That's going to be above that 4 limit. So that would technically be an exceedance of the MCL once the MCL is likely finalized at the same concentration levels. And then these 4 down here would be added together in that equation for the hazard index that I described earlier, and it is less than 1 if you do the math there. Other things to note, if you're poking around, BDL means below detection limit. So like the Gen X in South Jefferson Elementary is below detection limit, along with PFHXS, and FWNT is finished water nuts.
Could you repeat again what municipal water is?
Yeah, it's the water that's gone through the drinking water treatment process. Yeah, so they take it
Commercial.
Yeah, I can explain that better. It's the water that is going to be distributed to the customers. So they take it from the rivers and they take it from groundwater potentially, then it goes through the drinking water treatment plant, and then it's distributed to customers. So before it enters the drinking water treatment plant at that intake, that's where they did all the source water sampling. And then after the treatment process, before it was distributed to customers, that's where they did the finished waters.
And all of the locations that Jenna has talked about so far are public water sources.
Yeah, public water.
So that would not be if you have a private well. Correct. About that.
Okay, I'll be back here before we get overwhelmed by another table. Okay, South Jefferson Elementary was one of the public water systems where the finished water exceeded the proposed MCL. There were 18 other water systems in which the finished water testing exceeded the proposed MCL. They're all listed here, so I'm not going to go through this whole table. You can see that the exceedances are highlighted in red. Again, VDL means below detection limit, and there were 19 total. Yes, out of the initial 37 that were tested that exceeded the proposed standards, which is about 50%. But granted, the 37 that they started with were the ones that had kind of the highest levels based on the source water study. So we'll see once they finish doing the testing for all the 130 systems. So that was a lot. That was a lot. So we know, in conclusion and summary of this section, like we know that PFAS are ubiquitous. They're widespread in not only our water, but also in soil and also in animals, to include fish and birds and to include humans as well. Almost every adult American has PFAS in our blood. And so the question is, how do we reduce and eliminate PFAS so we can stop that cycle that I was describing earlier? And at the same time, right, we have real issues and real concerns about consuming PFAS contaminated drinking water. So it's kind of this balance of both minimizing harm to communities and individuals, and there's treatment technologies that exist. So on a public water system scale, they can use granular activated carbon, they can use ion exchange resin, reverse osmosis. That's also a good treatment technology for in-home filtration, and high pressure membrane system as well. And so that's like one piece of the puzzle. And then the other piece of the puzzle is, again, how do we stop the PFAS at the source so we can end the PFAS cycle? So Maria's going to tell us more about that and how you guys can move on.
Raise your hand if you learned something new during Jenna's presentation. I learned something new every single time Jenna talks, so I'm really grateful for you laying all of that out and kind of showing the framework. You might be slightly relieved to know that I do not do any science. I am more engaged on the community engagement side and the public policy side. So how do we communicate all of the really important stuff that Jenna just explained to our policymakers who are making decisions and to communities who are directly impacted? So I'm going to move a little bit into that section, and then we'll come back around and kind of bring it all together at the end. So I'm not going to go through this graphic again. Hopefully you learned some new things when Jenna was moving through it. The reason we brought it up again, though, is to reiterate that this is an extremely complex web of items to address. And the question becomes, where do we start and where do we get the money to do anything about it? So that's a little bit of what we are moving towards trying to figure out. We know, as Jenna stated, at the industry up at the top, that we have to address PFAS at the source. Because if we begin addressing it in other places in the cycle, and we're still introducing PFAS in new ways into the cycle, then we're kind of just spinning our wheels, right? So we know that we have to address PFAS at the source, at that industry place, so that as we reduce it there, we are then able to reduce in other places, and that has lasting effects, right? We're not just taking it out and pouring it back in. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. This was also the point behind the PFAS Protection Act. So some of you in this room were involved with the passage of House Bill 3189 last year during the West Virginia legislative session. The PFAS Protection Act aims to address PFAS at the source. And it is our role, or we are taking it on, to make sure that this piece of legislation is carried out effectively. So what did the PFAS Protection Act do? You can see this on the bullet points here to the left. It made sure that we are testing PFAS levels in finished water. So that's what Jenna was talking about. That is a process that has started. It is currently happening. It's ongoing. It is not completed. So we're going to talk a little bit about where we are with that. It also requires industry to monitor and report PFAS discharges. Extremely important when we're talking about addressing PFAS at the source. A third item that it does is it establishes limits on PFAS discharges into water immediately upon EPA's issuance of recommended criteria. So this essentially says that the state of West Virginia has to adopt whatever EPA puts out as a maximum contaminant level, and it won't adopt anything higher than that. That was written into the legislation at the last moment, but it will at least adopt what EPA puts out as that MCL, or maximum contamination level, for example, that Jenna was talking about. And the fourth item that it does is require the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, we're going to use DEP quite a bit, but requires DEP to develop site-specific action plans to address PFAS contamination in specific communities. So what that means is that for each of these communities that are contaminated, they will have a direct plan on exactly how they will address PFAS at the source and how they will remediate the contamination in time. So I have a little bit of a timeline here that I'm going to talk through. This timeline shows past, present, and future. And a few of the items we have named and a few of them we have not. So I'm going to walk through it. So in 2020, like Jenna stated, we had Senate Concurrent Resolution 46. So that was at the legislature where they essentially agreed this is a statewide issue and we need to learn more, right? It's often the first step. We need to find out a little bit more. So that is really what prompted the study that USGS completed. And in 2022, they put out those results like Jenna shared with you. So those were the source water study results. In 2023, we were able to pass the PFAS Protection Act and we had the initial finished water results. Again, that's in progress. Only the first 37 were completed, which is what you saw on that table. And we're waiting for the rest of those finished water results for all 130 systems across the state. There was also an item about the industry self-reporting. So that is something the industry was supposed to start self-reporting by the end of 2023. We have heard recently that we are still waiting to find out what those results have been compiled and what they actually look like. So we are pending additional information on that. We have not yet heard the results of that self-reporting. In 2024, so this is where we are right now, right? We have a few things coming out of the EPA. So if you look up above, that final MCL is going, that it's in draft form right now, right? That what Jenna shared, the 4 parts per trillion, it is going to be finalized. And we imagine that it will stay at that 4 parts per trillion level, but nothing will really happen from that until it's finalized. We also have some draft water quality criteria here as well. And we have the first 37 PFAS action plans that will be completed. So again, that was those 37 water systems that had the highest levels will begin finalizing their action plans, and that's DEP that has been charged with those action plans. And by the end of 2026, so in the next 2 to 3 years, all 130 action plans are supposed to be completed. So you might be asking yourself, what is an action plan? Because that's exactly what we're asking ourselves. So we do not know yet what those action plans have to entail. And that's kind of what we're waiting to find out / hoping to help steer. So this has brought us to our PFAS blueprint. And I want to point this out really quick. You might see these reports on the table. This is a 28-page report that West Virginia Rivers Coalition over the last few months has been putting together. And what this is as the subtitle states, the blueprint for implementing the PFAS Protection Act and accompanying responses to PFAS contamination in West Virginia. So essentially what this blueprint is a guide and a support to DEP to say, hey, we might not know what action plans include, but we want to help you figure it out. And here are all the many, many things that we should make sure are included in those action plans. So I'm going to go through those sections a little bit, but one thing I wanted to point out before I do so, two things. One is that many of the interactive maps that Jenna pointed you to earlier, whether it was the fish consumption advisories or the contamination sites across the country, those, a lot of them are linked in this report or they are footnoted at the end. So I really encourage everyone to grab a copy on your way out. If a 28-page report on paper feels totally overwhelming for you, which it does for me as well, we actually have one-pagers front and back. So that's going to be this paper, and it will kind of go through a brief explanation of what's in it. And then on the back, you'll see a QR code that you can scan and actually pull this report up online. So I encourage everybody before you leave, if you have interest in this, to go ahead and grab at least this one pager. It'll help walk you through some things, and it has a ton of resources. There's over 100 footnotes, or if you pull it up online, there will be links, hot links that you can go to understand kind of how we believe, or some of the considerations we believe should be in the process of beginning to address this. So in the report, some of the sections include an introduction to PFAS, somewhat similar to what we've gone through tonight. There's a section about developing PFAS action plans, there's policy recommendations, and then there's stakeholder and community engagement, which we feel is incredibly important. So I'm going to go over section 2 really quick, because again, you already had the introduction to PFAS. Section 2 goes into developing PFAS action plans. So what will these action plans actually include? This is an excerpt from the PFAS Protection Act that states that action plans, to the extent that data is available, shall identify the source or sources of PFAS in the raw water and kind of some of the regulatory options that we have for beginning to address that. So some of the ways that we feel we will need to identify PFAS sources is by using readily available data and sources, some of which Jenna pointed you to, like I stated, one of which is the EPA's PFAS analytic tool. So this is a tool where you can go online and again, look up some state boundaries, and they can begin to show some of what is already being tracked, like the Superfund data and whether someone's a PFAS manufacturer or importer. So you can go through and kind of add or remove these layers over here, and they can begin to give you a bit of the story about what PFAS is in this region, right? But again, this is only a piece of the story. So if you think back to that whole complex web, it's only really that industry section, or maybe it has a couple other sections in that web, but it's not going to give you the full picture. So it's just kind of one piece. The developing PFAS action plan section also has a consideration section for how to begin addressing PFAS sources. So it includes manufacturing and industrial uses, legacy industrial sites, publicly owned treatment works, or sort of those places where some of the water is processed, as Jenna stated before, land application of biosolids, which has come up as a very important topic, especially in this area, because farmers have come to us and said, we've been encouraged to spread this biosolid sludge for this amount of time. Are we going to be held responsible for this? And we, don't believe that they should, but we do believe that it has to be stopped immediately, right? That we can't keep spreading this, as Jenna said, and keep adding PFAS into the cycle. So it's a very multi-pronged issue. I really encourage you to take a look at this report because it goes into each of these sections in a little bit more detail. It also addresses PFAS treatment at drinking water plants, which Jenna touched on a little bit as well, and sort of some of the resources that might be needed in order to address that. Section 3 addresses policy recommendations. If anybody's looking at the report, this starts on page 17. And some of the issues that we have talked about tonight includes additional sampling and monitoring efforts to make sure that we have all the information and are continuing to gather information on PFAS levels. Eliminating non-essential uses of PFAS. So this is really where we talk about addressing PFAS at the source and stopping from creating more and adding more into that cycle. Establishing PFAS water quality criteria, which we've addressed as well. Looking at our West Virginia National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. I'm like, oh, it's a hard one to get out. Looking at some of these permits where we are tracking items, but we're not always tracking PFAS. So that's an example with the biosolids where they're making sure certain things are not in biosolids, but might not be looking for PFAS in all these areas. So we want to add that as a criteria that we're addressing. We also have a section on addressing PFAS in private drinking water wells, fish consumption advisories. And another one I wanted to call out is updating existing protection mechanisms that we have, like source water protection plans, which we have across the state to incorporate PFAS reduction strategies. And section 4 of the blueprint involves community and stakeholder engagement. So this we feel is a super important piece. We know that DEP could just say, you know, based on all the things we're tracking, here's what we're going to do about PFAS contamination. But we really feel that it's important for the community to have a voice in this process and to be able to weigh in on where some of those sources may be and what some of the remediation efforts should look like. So one thing I did want to call out, we were just funded from EPA's Environmental Justice Government to Government Grant, G2G, in partnership with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection to take some of this work on. Because while the PFAS Protection Act was an amazing piece of legislation, and we're so grateful that it passed, it was an unfunded mandate. So it said, hey, go do all these things and good luck, because there's no money for you. So we were really, and still are, very stressed out about what that means, because it puts out so much in motion and says we should be doing this, but doesn't actually allocate the resources to do so. So we're going to some other places where there are funds available, this grant being one of them, to say what can we do from an environmental justice standpoint to begin remediating these efforts. And I wanted to call out some of the Eastern Panhandle communities that this grant specifically engages with. So that includes Berkeley Springs, Charlestown, Harpers Ferry, Kearneysville, Martinsburg, and Summit Point. Were all written into the grant specifically because they have water systems that are in those 37 that Jenna talked about earlier. So this is work that I specifically wanted to call out because it's work that we're going to be looking to all of you to help engage in. We really, as I said, feel that it's crucial for the community to have a voice in this process. And that's really what this grant for the next few years is going to try to initiate. And again, just like I stated down here, this will kind of be a pilot in community engagement process as well, where we're saying to DEP, if this works and if this gives you all information, this should be the community engagement process that you all replicate for environmental justice issues across the state of West Virginia. Like this should be the baseline, because we really believe that giving communities an effective voice is going to make these plans more responsive and actually be able to like long-term address a lot of these issues in community. The example of actually, let me see that on the site. So how can you get more involved? Well, like I said, we want you to join us for PFAS Action Plan community meetings in 2024. So these are going to be listening sessions. They are going to be smaller group sessions where we're workshopping some of the topics that are coming up in the PFAS action plan and saying we want your voice to be included in those action plans. I also wanted to shout out Jefferson County Foundation, who's here in the room. They are one of the many community partners that is in that environmental justice G2G grant along with us. So we have Harpers Ferry Waterworks, Jefferson County Foundation, Potomac Valley Audubon Society. This is a multi-group effort that have all come together and said we as community-based organizations who are already here and established in these communities want to help make this issue better, and we will do what we can to kind of team up and spread these resources. So they are groups that were involved in the G2G grant and will be included in the action planning process as we move forward. And I also want to take a second because another thing Jefferson County Foundation is doing is private well testing. So they have done really incredible work recently where, as we stated before, a lot of the sampling efforts have been in public water systems, which is great if you're connected to city water, you kind of know what your city water system levels are. But if you have a private well, which many of us here in the Eastern Panhandle do, you're kind of left with no resources and no information. So Chrissy, I'm gonna turn it over to you for a second if you'd like to just shout out your program really quick and share what you all have been doing.
Yeah, so we have a private well testing program. We are just finishing the first tranche. We had a pilot program at the end of last year. We're trying to figure out how to do it. And then we are just finishing our first tranche of well testing. We've done 51 wells. We have the results back for 39 of those wells. Of those 39 wells, just to kind of give you an idea, 30 of those 39 wells, 29 of those wells have PFAS, and 11 of them have them in that range where you were saying it was massive, the 55, the 20 to 55. So there's wells in the county that have quite a bit of PFAS in them. And so if you want to participate in our well testing program, just if you have a well and you'd like to have it tested, grab me after. You can also email the foundation, at the Jefferson County Foundation at gmail.com. It's easy to go to our website if you need. So yeah, I was trying to be cool enough to show you that, but
When you testing, when we get to the county well,
no. So we work in the whole Eastern Panhandle. So as long as we're not stepping on someone else's feet, we're happy to test outside of that. I'm just gonna show you, this is our map. These are all the wells that have been tested. I'm not as cool as having it up there, but all the red ones are ones with PFAS and all the blue ones are ones without PFAS. And the really interesting thing you can see here, I'm trying to bring this up, is that they're right next to each other because it's karst. And so this is exactly what our two karst hydrogeologists said would happen, is that you would get wells right next to each other where one was positive and one was negative. And some of these, like the positive one is at 30 parts per trillion and the negative one is undetectable. So, which is still remains negative, it's just undetectable. So anyway, if you're interested in participating or you know someone who might be, please contact me. So.
And that is a good segue. We also have a sign up list in the middle table. And I really encourage, if you're interested in this topic, to sign up, because as these opportunities become available and as we have more community meetings in the Eastern Panhandle specifically, we'll make sure the information gets out. We'll also share it with Duck Valley Audubon Society, Jefferson County Foundation. It's kind of a web, so we'll make sure. And the reason I felt it was really important to name the groups in the room and the many groups not in the room tonight as well who are involved in this process, and if I miss anybody, is as that web shows, it's going to take all of us. It's a very multi-pronged effort that we will need to address this. And so really it's our goal to work together. And the last way that you can get involved is to check out our PFAS blueprint and let us know what questions still remain for you. When we come into a presentation like this, there's kind of so much growing information all the time. It's hard to know exactly where to focus. And if we get questions from you all, even if we can't answer them tonight during the question segment, we will do what we can to keep them on our radar and try to get more information out to people as we move forward. So with that, I thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being here on Valentine's Day evening, and for sharing your time with us, and we're open to any questions you have.
Thank you. This is excellent. You guys have done an excellent job. And I have worked with EPA and other coalition groups. So I come from a lot of experience, but not on this topic. Question for the, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, with the private wells, which I think would include anyone who has a private well, is what are you going to do with that information and how is it going to impact the homeowner who eventually down the road wants to sell their house? And then now they are left with this information that they have to actually do something with. And I think that would be a really big concern for people. So have you actually, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, what we're doing with it is a two-pronged answer. So the first answer is obviously we're sharing with the homeowner. We're not sharing anyone's information. Jefferson County Foundation has been in the business of well testing for 6 years. Diane, who sits next to me here, designed our first program, and thanks to all of her really hard work, we do have a very good program that's very professionally done, all done by professionals. None of us touch any of the samples, and nor is anyone. It's all backed up by expert witnesses and that kind of thing that needs to be used. We provide the information to the homeowners. If the homeowners volunteer, we also provide the information to West Virginia Rivers. So the West Virginia Rivers can use this information to further lobby. We don't provide it under the person's name. So it's not like, you know, Joe Smith, well, had this much PFAS in it, right? So, you can also choose not to share your information. It doesn't mean you can't participate.
And wouldn't it be, have to be disclosable, as a, part of something?
When you sell your
When you
property.
sell your home?
So I'm not an attorney, and I would suggest, and we do suggest when people ask us that question, which is a common question, that they seek legal advice from an attorney licensed in West Virginia and specializing in that area as well.
Well, I certainly can't be the first one that would have asked that question.
Many
so-
people have asked it, and that's what we say.
Yeah, but so,
Because we're not.
because that would make
We
me
can't give legal
reluctant,
advice.
for example, if I had my own well, it
Sure.
would make me reluctant to just go ahead and volunteer, even though I'm a scientist at heart, and I would actually be very interested in the results.
So
But-
two things I'll say about that. So, one is that many people have that same question. Many people have asked us that. We tell them all they should seek legal advice if they're concerned, because we just cannot give legal advice.
Okay,
Because we're not attorneys and we shouldn't be what we're not.
Sure.
And so we can't do that. There have been people that have certainly decided not to participate. And then the second thing is, the volunteering. So some people are confused that either the foundation is making money off of the program, or the program is going to help more than just the homeowner. We'll probably help the homeowner most, but as a group, we provide a lot of data that will help West Virginia Rivers lobby.
sure.
I will say that, like, for example, the program that we just finished cost between $25,000 and $30,000. West Virginia Rivers, partnered with the foundation, and the homeowners covered a portion of that. Jefferson County Foundation covered a portion of it, and West Virginia Rivers covered a portion of it. No one made money. And so we all, paid. So some people think that, I'm volunteering to support West Virginia Rivers or support the foundation. You are supporting the advancement of knowledge and hopefully the advancement of the laws of West Virginia. But, just so everybody is aware of it, it's not something we're making money.
And also
Thank
that's
you.
why it's in our, and thank you so much for the work that you've done, this because you worked so hard, and that's also why it's in our policy recommendations, because private wells are essentially a policy gap right now, right? It's like a hole where there's no policy to cover people who have private wells, as their drinking water source. So that's something we're working to address as well, which is why we hope to, partner and protect people's information, but, by using just kind of general spatial information without direct addresses, say to policymakers, this is why we need to continue to give resources to this growing.
Is there any chance of getting, county health department money?
So I think
Probably not,
probably not this time, and maybe you guys from policy standpoint are better at this, but I would say that when we've gone to them before about our concerns about other pollutants, they've mostly focused on the EPA's guidelines. So I would say that until, I'm very interested in your opinion, but until the EPA says this is the standard, and they may even have to go on and say this is the standard for private drinking before we come. What do you think?
Exactly, yeah, I think it's all, they operate based on the standards, and I also think that they are responsible for public water systems, which is why they have had to test public water systems, but, private wells are sort of out of the county's regulatory purview, I would say.
Yeah.
So they are not gonna be put, because we've asked that of like, why aren't there resources going to this? And they're sort of like, well, right now it's out of our.
Yeah.
They only check for bacteria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
Or like-
know, they
The
make
other
it
thing
that
is,
way.
like I would say, well testing of private wells. I was surprised when we went to expand our well testing program to include PFAS. Because we have had, not easy, but we've been able to, like, design programs around whatever contaminant we wanted to. There was significant pushback from the laboratories that run these tests about testing private wells. And we didn't realize that, like, a homeowner can't just call up and get their water tested. It's not how for PFAS. And we really had to work hard to convince the labs, once they realized we were testing like private people's wells, to work with us. And so, which we were able to do, but I'm just gonna say it's not as straightforward.
One thing I wanted to mention too, walking into the crowd is like an interactive activity. I also wanted to bring this CycloPure testing kit. So what Christy is talking about, a method that they use, is through a certified lab. It's an EPA approved method that they are using. And so as Christy stated, this is totally, like lab certified and very, it's a more formal process. The item that I wanted to share is called a CycloPure. So this is not an EPA certified method. This is a method that you would gather and collect the sample at your own home. But if you are interested, these are kind of the new technology that people are using. Again, not EPA certified, but they run $79 a piece. And you can get a good idea. I know the town of Shepherdstown, for example, just did, an individual did a CycloPure test and said, here are the results I got. I want to compare that to the EPA certified test that you all get back. And they were doing some comparisons. So a lot of studies have been done about kind of how accurate this is. It's not going to give you the exact or the very specific information that Chrissy is talking about, but it could give you kind of a ballpark idea at a more affordable rate, should you be interested. So I wanted to shout that out, and I can share this with folks, but it's truly just a collection cup that you can, you kind of gather it yourself at home, and you can do both finished water with this. You can also do surface water, so you can test in rivers and streams. And so it's kind of an all around affordable method, but again, not as like affordable as what the well testing program is using.
That's good for one test.
It is, it's good for one test, and they're, I think, 79.
And it's mailed off as well.
It is, yep, you mail it off, and it gives you the whole instructions. You fill out this card, and it gives you gloves to use, so it gives you the step-by-step of exactly what to do to make sure your sample is as accurate as possible, and then you mail it off to them, and they send your results back in a certain period of time. Did you have any other questions?
I did have one other question. How is the source of the contamination being determined? I live near South Jefferson High School. I'm sure that they're not the source, but it may be some point racial. So how are they going to determine for South Jefferson where that contamination is coming?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's the question that DEP and West Virginia Rivers and our partners and with the community are like gonna try to answer. So, you know, DEP and a lot of the state agencies are gonna be using those mapping tools that I showed you a little bit, right? Like, okay, you know, according to EPA's PFAS analytic tools, there's this potential PFAS discharger in this area. And that's one bubble of information. And then there's another bubble of information, which is from people who live in the area, like you just said, like Center Point Raceway. Maybe that wouldn't show up on some of these maps that like DEP and other stakeholders might be using. So we're gonna use that like two-pronged approach, is using like the science and the you know, the mapping tools and the information that is out there and publicly available, along with community knowledge to try to figure out where the sources are. And we didn't mention, but as part of the PFAS action plan, there's money for testing. So like, we all get together in a room and we say, okay, we think that these are the three sources. And I don't remember how many tests are included in like one community's action plan development process, but there are PFAS tests included, and DEP is contracting with an outside company to do those tests. So we're gonna use that information to try to figure out where the sources are for those water systems that have levels exceeding. Did that answer
They
your
would
question?
have firefighting,
Yeah.
they would have firefighting things.
Yeah.
and They would do all sorts of stuff with the State Department and another part of it.
And Summit Point is one of the communities, for example, that is going to be focused on, and that's exactly kind of the conversation we would hope would emerge, that then we can say, hey, these three sources or potential sources came out of our conversation, they need to be tested and addressed.
It should be a gradient. Which can use, just use vectors. What are the gradient that will point to the source?
Yeah, and I think that the consultants that are assisting DEP with the development of those PFAS action plans are gonna do, that kind of.
And unfortunately, just really quick, because I heard someone shout out in the crowd, in the Eastern Panhandle, we have karst landscape. So what that means is it's really, from what I understand, not a hydrologist, but it's really porous rock. So essentially water moves a lot underground and it's all very connected. So Dr. Sandkit, who's with USGS, always says it's like we're all drinking from the same, and sometimes he says toilet bowl and sometimes he says bowl of water. You know, they give kind of different images in your head, but it's really as if it's that, right? We're all sharing the same pot. So we would hope to use vectors, but it's actually a lot more interconnected underneath. And so it gets a little bit more complex.
Thank you both so much for all of this information. It is tremendously terrifying. Just kind of going back to, obviously systemic change takes a long time and is difficult and expensive to enforce. And so let's say I am one of those like brave homeowners in Jefferson County that decides to get my private well or even like a commercial drinking source water or the finished water tested. And I find that there are very concerning levels of PFAS in my drinking water. Can you go back to the ways that I, as an individual, could like interrupt? Obviously, like it will take time for the systemic change to interrupt the source water PFAS and then the finished water PFAS. But how could I, as like a person just living here, maybe interrupt it from my tap?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would encourage you to take the handout that's next to our sign-up sheet. It's from the PFAS Exchange, which is out of the Silent Spring Institute. And I would say a reverse osmosis in-home filtration system, there are some that you can put under the sink would be your best bet. You could also use a carbon filter. I think the reverse osmosis would be a little more expensive, but they provide some more specific details on like the types of systems that you would want to consider as a homeowner.
And the only other thing to add to that too, Environmental Working Group put out a list of their recommended filters as well. They're another really good resource, and they ranked them based on like most affordable, longest lasting, shortest time until you have to change out the filter, kind of all these different categories that they base them on. So I would say those two resources are really good.
Maria, can I ask a question of that? So,
Yes.
so let's say you put that in under your sink, you concentrate all this PFAS into that filter. How do you dispose of that filter without becoming the source polluter yourself?
That is a fantastic question. Yep. That's a fantastic question. So when they're doing it on a large scale, what we know is that these systems can send the used, I was gonna say, you actually, can send the cement carbon away and recharge it up to a certain amount of time. So they can filter it out, and put it back in the system to reuse it again. That can only happen up to a certain amount of time. And the big question is, what do we do then? And that's a question that a lot of the drinking water facilities are asking as well. To your point, if you send it to the landfill, it's going back into the cycle, right? So these are huge questions, and quite honestly, I would say this is a huge question we don't have an answer to. There's a lot of questions in this cycle that we can't fully answer, but I think we're, in the process of answering it.
I would think too that whatever company you choose to like potentially purchase that from would have guidance on that. So I would encourage you to do a little digging into like the company's guidance.
The most reverse osmosis systems actually flush themselves. I'm not sure if you're aware that you recommended it, but the reverse osmosis systems periodically flush the things that they filtered out down their drain. So you don't want to become the source of concentrating and we don't use that. But what size filtration? They usually have like a micron level or something. They look like fairly large molecules. So it seemed like the cheaper, and you said carbon filters, there's many factor charcoal and carbon filters out there. And what about for air quality? Is the HEPA filter going to filter out the air quality in your house? We have a high quality HEPA filter in our environmental system in the house, and we have some micro, I forget the micron level, but I can check. So water filtration systems. And the other thing I mentioned is that most of these systems, particularly in this county, because of the karst, which has a lot of calcium in it, reverse osmosis also doesn't work very well because they get lined up very quickly.
Okay, yeah, thank you for pointing out all those points. That's certainly good to know. As far as the air filter, I don't know. But we are kind of taking note of questions that we don't have the answer to tonight, and we can try to get back with y'all through Thomas Valley Audubon Society if they want to share. I don't know, whoever attended, we could email y'all and answer that question, but I don't know the answer to the questions.
Those viruses get through there.
Not the HEPA ones,
They get through those too. And the officer, I have 3 doctors.
Okay.
That post their papers. We'll get through most of those molecules are small.
I also want to name that West Virginia Rivers has a policy and advocacy focus. Our kind of science reach only extends so far, and that's also why we look to a lot of groups who have additional expertise as well to kind of add that into our realm of understanding. And this is continuing to grow. One thing that I think is really interesting, I've seen more products in the grocery store that now say PFAS free, or, so I think it is coming a little bit more into like the public understanding of what this means and what we have to do to address it. So I hope that that continues to be the case, and that, 2 years from now, we have a lot more options standing up here to tell you all about the EPs.
Yeah, and I would also say just like the literature as far as kind of indoor air exposure is growing quickly. Like it's not as expansive as like the water or the food exposure is, and so that's probably something that's
Do you know if the farmers around here are using biosolids? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are.
We can all smell it.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like I stated before, have been encouraged to do so, right? So we know that it helps plants grow when they get certain nutrients, but we also don't know what else is in that, those biosolids that are being spread. So that's part of the research that more information is needed.
I just wanted to comment that, we talked about sources of this contamination, but back in the Wild West days of industry, which we may still be in the Wild West days of industry, we may not know. But, in the 50s, plants around here probably were spewing that as well as many other things. So we're, we've dug ourselves into a hole. Regardless of how much we're putting in now, there was a lot put in before.
Right. Yeah, a lot of those legacy industrial sites, which may be included in EPA's Superfund and like circular programs, but also.
Just before that, what she was saying about like where it might have come from, that's like not there anymore. EPA does have method 537. Like we're running method 533, where there's different methods. And there's a more expensive test. Well, if you get a positive test, you're like, I want to know where this came from. Like you start to get mad. That test, the point of that test is supposed to help figure out where it did come from. I mean, it's not going to come up and be like, it came from the 3M plant.
Located at 532.
I
I wish.
But apparently that test, the point of that test is to help track down where it delineates the chemicals into more substances. Anyway, 533 test.
That's true too, because like some PFAS, for example, the PFAS is like a marker of PFAS that's been used in firefighting foams. So like depending on which PFAS you find, like that's also information about potential.
And like here in Arizona, we had you know, like, we have the firefighting program over there, then we have the 3M plan, and we also have, like, where they do the fire extinguishers, which was actually a super fun, so not the ground site in town, but else. Anyway.
Like,
If we're all drinking out of the same bowl, and,
just say bold.
and the polluters are dumping into that bowl. And it's voluntary, letting us know how much they're pissing in the bowl. How do we get there? How do you get beyond voluntary? Are these chemicals now listed on the toxic release inventory?
Many of them are, yeah.
But the trouble with that is that if you don't produce, use, or pollute 25,000 pounds or more a year, you're not on that list. So I'm a small guy. I'm pissing in the bowl. It's voluntary. How do we get to getting to the source?
Yeah.
Because as you know, at Harper's Ferry, we're at the bottom of Elks Run.
Yeah.
And if there are a bunch of people above us who are dumping in that bowl, we're in trouble.
That's a great question. And I think that is, it's like the PFAS Protection Act is like a tip of the iceberg that we know a lot more lives below that. And it's exactly what you just said. It's kind of like, oh, they'll self-report.
I think to add to what you said,
Yeah.
how does the self-reported data?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do know that, I used to teach environmental economics, and I do know that TRI, the big TRI emitters, reduce their emissions because of public disclosure. And so one of the questions is there anything in all of this action plans that's about public disclosure? That is,
The self-reporting, yeah. I mean, I don't remember how many PFAS EPA has incorporated into the toxic release inventory, but I mean, regardless, it doesn't answer your question about those that are just releasing like small amounts. I don't know, I think that's where like pre-treatment testing comes in more and just like more testing and also the policy levers that we have. So Maria mentioned the water quality criteria, the draft water quality criteria for human health that EPA is supposed to come out with by the end of this year. And so once there's like a number that we can say that West Virginia adopts and that we can say, hey, you can't discharge above this number or this concentration, excuse me, of PFAS with your NPDES permit, I think that's going to be really powerful. Yeah, and I think and coupled with that might be some like monitoring requirements included. And there are pre-discharge monitoring requirements associated with those NPDES permits. So I think like it's going to be like some state policy levers and also like EPA changes.
And I think it speaks to the question earlier, like, will they do anything about private, well, probably not until they have to. So we're kind of, again, a multi-pronged approach where we're saying we want to include it in the regulatory measures that they have to meet. And in the meantime, we need to do a whole lot else. We know that this is currently in our space.
So the data you presented, were those essentially snapshots of time? And has any work been done to show the stability of those numbers? Do those numbers go up and down depending on, you know, how much flow is stream or, you know, is anybody looking at that or not? If you measure again, you're going to get the same.
Right. Those are snapshots in time, so do take them with a grain of salt. And I mean, if there's increased flow, you would expect dilution, so maybe the concentrations would be lower. And I don't know, I'm sure the USGS is doing some of that work, kind of like the flow monitoring, matching up with the PFAS sampling. That is who I would say is probably doing that work, but I don't know for sure.
I also know that, the River Keepers Network is a really awesome group of folks, and specifically the Potomac River Keepers are a group that are doing a lot of sampling in the area. And they are specifically going out and taking tests every month to kind of compare how this data changes over time. And so they're actively doing that work. The difficult problem is their funding right now is coming from Maryland. So they are doing Maryland-based testing, but the good news for us is that the Potomac flows between Maryland and West Virginia. So a lot of their information we're able to transfer and kind of understand how that's showing up in our region. So I think a lot of this testing is being done, but again, we're in this exploratory phase.
How tight are the bonds, the carbon bonds? And is there a mechanism, a way to break those bonds? And if the bonds are broken, is there an aftermarket for the byproducts? If we could address that, then the PFAS are addressed right at the output. And the byproducts are sold. So the company makes money. They have to invest in technology to break the bonds. They're going to sell the byproducts and recover their money. So that's one issue. Are there cases, medical cases, disease cases diagnosed due to PFAS? Okay, there are. I didn't know.
I would really recommend, I'm just gonna weigh in really quick, would really recommend everyone to watch the movie Dark Waters. It is a dramatized film, and so it is Mark Ruffalo, and, does a really awesome job, but I think it really gives a framework of an understanding of what took place in Parkersburg. And they talk a lot about the human health testing that was done. It was actually the single largest human study, at the time, or maybe to this day. I have to check up on that, but it was really impressive. They had a ton of people turn out and to understand what the effects of DuPont, which is now Chemours, in that region was, and they speak a lot to that, so.
Yeah, that was the outcome of the class action lawsuit back in the 2000s. And I think it was 70,000 West Virginians that participated in that medical monitoring study. That was, I believe it was about 10 years or so. And if you want to read lots of long documents about the linkage between PFOA, specifically PFOA exposure, and some of the cancers that they found. If you go to C8, it's C8 Science Panel. If you Google like C8 Science Panel, that'll take you to that website that has all the information from that medical monitoring study and also information about that law.
What equipment is needed to measure 4 parts per million or 4 parts per trillion? Is that standard equipment?
I know, I'm familiar that EPA has 2 drinking water analytical methods for measuring PFAS in drinking water, and I do not know the equipment.
Yeah, well, I don't know the analyzer's name.
It's out there, it's being used.
It can't measure that. But the lowest it can measure is like.
Well, that's the standard, how we measure it.
Well, it can measure to 4 parts, and otherwise.
Yeah, 4, not 0.00.
Correct.
That's what I said,
Correct.
4 parts. Okay.
Oh, 4 parts, sorry, I think I said.
What about bottled water? What's in bottled water is no different than any water, any other water site.
That's a great question. Bottled water isn't regulated by the EPA, it's regulated by the FDA. And so the FDA basically goes through this process to decide like, okay, EPA set out these standards, like which ones do we think we should adopt that are applicable to bottled water? So the jury is out on whether they're going to adopt anything related to PFAS, but it is regulated by the FDA and not.
Also, a very interesting recent study came out about nanoplastics that were found in bottled water, and I think that's incredibly important because we know plastics have PFAS, and then we also know plastics are not good for us to consume for many other reasons. And so that was a very large scale study that recently was published. If you Google it, I know that it will come up. It was on the front pages, and I recommend going there. We do not recommend bottled water as a suitable alternative.
Can I ask another question? Most of the winter vegetables and fruits in the United States come from somewhere in the developing world. What do we know about environmental supply chain practices? So if I buy blueberries from Peru, which I do regularly, how the heck do I know whether or not they're contaminated with high levels of PFAS? Because you all said that's a crop that sucks up a lot of water.
That's a great question. I did not know about Peru's environmental regulations.
There are environmental supply chains, and there are, the stewardship, the fish people, they've got one around fish. There's gotta be environmental supply chains for the fruit, or maybe there isn't, I don't know. So
Yeah.
if there
And
is,
that's a tricky one too, because even if we tested that blueberry in Peru to understand what levels of PFAS it had to move through so many processing sites to get to your hands here in the United States. So like
that's what an
that
environmental
is a
supply
lot.
chain study would do.
Exactly,
It would
yeah.
track it from
Mhm.
where it's grown.
That's a great question.
And tomatoes, another water intensive crop, they all come from somewhere in the developing world.
You can get them locally from low carbon plants, we are all getting them.
Mhm. Yes.
But there's no feedback. But you won't use as much gasoline.
I mean, it's tricky too, because like, as you saw in that, the map of the, concentrations of PFOS in birds, like a lot of the data and the monitoring that's going on in regarding PFAS is in North America, in Europe, and then in that small portion of Asia. So it might not be, like, they might not have that information. It might not be testing that information. It would be like, South America. I'm not sure though. That's a great question. We'll look into.
You're always asking the big questions, Mike. Yeah.
I have a few questions actually. I know a lot about the actual testing processes, but actually Steve and some people from the technology filters. You know, he mentioned a lot of times we'll take our filters out of our water plants. We'll do what's called CIP, the acid CIP and chemical CIPs. Well, essentially, like Steve said, you're taking all that steel off of the filter and reintroducing it back into the water. So you're not really, it's all staying there. I guess, you know, is there a chemical that can take it out of solution and just precipitate it out instead of having to filter it completely? So where it's just in our sludge at the lagoon, just dry it out, scrape it up and take it to some sanitary site.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any technologies like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's like research going into developing technologies like that.
I would say if anyone's feeling well rested, you all are coming up with some great ideas. And I would say if you can come up with the technology, I would love for you to, so. Did you have other questions?
Yeah, my question is about the testing. You know, we add a lot to our water, like fluorine and fluoride and stuff. So we're adding this fluorine, which then make PFAS. So even the heat of some of these pumps that this water is pumped through to catalyze the fluorine is turned into other PFAS. So it's like, it's a two-factor thing. We have the influent water, which has it, we're producing it minusculely. I don't know where. I remember. So, you know, we have chlorine in our water. At the plant, it's at a higher concentration than further out in our distribution system. If we're doing our tests at the distribution site, where we're actually getting their drinking water from, is that chlorine residual going to affect that test even though it's chlorine, not chlorine? And, you know, is that gonna, like,
Yeah, I wouldn't think so, that the chlorine would change the result of the PFAS testing of it, at the distribution, right?
One question that was brought up that was an interesting point, and this made me remember as well. We actually toured the Big Springs water treatment plant a few months back, and they had installed a granular activated carbon filtration system. And they were talking to us about the long chain PFAS. So there are different substances that have a longer chain, like Jenna showed you, of the C's and the F versus the shorter chain. And they said they were having success filtering out the longer chain PFAS, but as the chains got smaller, it was more difficult because they were having a lot of breakthrough. So essentially these smaller chains were able to break through the filtration system they had available. That's how I was explaining it, at least from a non-scientific perspective. And that was really fascinating to me because you asked about, can we break them down? And the answer also might be yes, but only to a certain extent. And then they were finding that they had to change out their filtration system more frequently than they expected in order to capture those shorter chain stuff. So there's a lot that we're continuing to learn.
So you mentioned freshwater fish. What about saltwater fish for fish in lakes? And have lakes been tested for contamination? Any issue on saltwater fish?
I'm not familiar with saltwater fish, but I would guess if it's like basically cycling through the global water cycle, like it's in ocean water, and so working in saltwater fish, but maybe at lower concentrations, because it's just a massive body of water we're talking about compared to like a small river, or relatively small fish, like you're going into the ocean.
I know the Great Lakes have had warnings and issued guidelines on the consumption of fish that were caught in the Great Lakes
Yeah.
because of mercury.
Yeah,
Now, I haven't been there for a while, so I don't know if PFAS is now a warning up there. as
They
well.
actually have some of the most impressive fish consumption advisories, and in our blueprint that I spoke about earlier, this document, we reference the Great Lakes, a lot of the work that's being done there, because they've kind of been cutting edge for some of the, especially fish consumption advisories.
they really have, yeah. I think a lot of it is because it's like old DOT sites and like military sites, kind of like along the Great Lakes, but the states bordering the Great Lakes are certainly testing those lakes. There are PFAS in the fish, and they are kind of taking that next step in issuing fish consumption advisories.
So we know what's going on in West Virginia. Are there similar programs, similar efforts in other states that you know
Oh, yeah. I would say we are behind the game. And that other states are much more far along as far as testing efforts, as far as like adopting pieces of legislation that ban non-essential uses of PFAS, right? As far as issuing fish consumption advisories. A lot of those policy recommendations that Maria discussed and are included in this blueprint were taken from what other states have passed, successful legislation, or, guidances that have passed. in other states.
of? What about the consumption of wild game?
Good question. There are some studies of PFAS in deer. And it would really, right, either be like moving up through the food chain or through the water that they're drinking. So, right, if the rivers and streams and lakes have PFAS and they're drinking straight from that water, certainly brings their treatment and they are being exposed. I'm not familiar with what the levels are.
I mean, you're in West Virginia. We eat possums and raccoons and all sorts of other stuff.
Yeah.
And it's essential, I mean, that's one topic that's come up too, is for people who are using subsistence, foraging or hunting or fishing. This is a huge issue, because if part of their essential food source is coming from the river and we're telling them you can't eat that fish, or you shouldn't eat that fish, or if you do, it's gonna poison you, this is a huge issue. So I think you bring up a really good topic, and continuing to understand that.
I'll ask my last question. You've got, I forget, it's 30 public water systems that are above the 4.0.
37,
7.
19.
Well,
19.
no, 19,
That were
of the, yeah.
19,
either the 4.0 or the hazard.
right? Now, let's say the EPA comes out with 4 parts per trillion as the standard.
Mhm.
And now I've got a treat. And I've heard that Martinsburg has bought a treatment system, the activated charcoal, and it costs somewhere between 10 and $18 million. If that's true, and you've got a bunch of small systems, like in Harper's Ferry, we've got a plant that's $6.5 million. That's barely financially stable. How the heck do we afford a $10 million activated charcoal system if we're over the standard?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would think that it would be a less expensive price tag for Harper's Ferry compared to Martinsburg, but, and I hate to say like, oh, the federal funding is coming down, but that is one piece of the answer. That EPA does have, they're putting a lot of funding into what's called the state revolving funds, which are funds that are used for water treatment plant infrastructure upgrades, like specifically targeted towards PFAS, like their emerging contaminant portion of those funds. They've increased investments in those funds. There's also some small and disadvantaged communities grants that EPA is putting forth too for communities. And another thing I would say, some other states are, and other water utilities as well, are kind of like, they're suing the polluters, right? I'm pretty sure there's like a class action lawsuit that has the option of opting into to sue 3M for funding to implement the upgrades that are gonna be necessary for them to meet.
You're not suggesting that we sue the farmers, are you?
Oh, no.
Absolutely.
The initial, the industry polluters, the initial source.
We're also not suggesting you sue anyone because again, we are not attorneys and we are
We're not.
based on a policy now because of your perspective. Right? I'm like, thank you, Chrissy.
But those are the main like sources of funding that, you know, if you want to call a lawsuit a source of funding, right, that.
Yeah. One is that the EPA's money tends to come through the state. And these are water projects, state, you have to qualify for those funds. And within, and that's typically based off of your median household income. Within the state of West Virginia, the Eastern Panhandle is up at the top of across the whole state. So there are very few water systems in the Panhandle that qualify for any of this free EPA. That's a real problem here, you know, it's hard, you know, hard to get that one. And then, the second one was, yeah, it was
Suing
yeah, money.
3M and
And then the lawsuits, so yes, there are class action lawsuits out right now. Okay, to sign on with where these massive polluters are agreeing to settle now. Okay, but we don't know what it's really gonna cost us
Right.
all from.
Right.
And if you sign on as part of the class action, oftentimes that means you give up your right to sue them later on. Okay, so if you buy in now to the class action, and you really don't know, you know, what your situation is, and what it's gonna cost you to fix this. Okay, then you find out that whatever you bought after the attorneys, class action attorneys took picture. Okay, then you wind up potentially with, you know, only a fraction of what it's gonna cost you to fix it. And you've given up your right at that point to go after them.
Right, exactly.
And this is what most small utilities around the country, I'll say, but I definitely know around the state are grappling with. Harper's Ferry included, I was at a Charlestown Utility Board meeting a few months back and they were grappling with these same questions. So I think this is a continued conversation and I don't know that there's a right answer.
Yeah.
Really not.
Yeah, I really do wanna look to be able to answer that question better, like look into EPA's like small systems pot of money that isn't through the SRF funds, because it's for small systems or disadvantaged communities. You don't have to be both. So I think that it's possible the smaller systems might be able to access that funding through that funding source, but
The firefighting gun is used, and I know working at the air guard base in Martinsburg, that it's been released there multiple times into the groundwater. Are they doing anything to change the chemicals so that it doesn't have to be PFAS in the firefighting food?
yeah.
So that we get better over time.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Martinsburg specifically, but there are, like in other places, they have adopted, you know, created firefighting foam that doesn't include the PFAS product.
You know, when you talk about checking water at Big Spring, that's the one right along Route 11 there.
Yes.
Air guard base.
Yes.
So is that probably where that came from?
Yeah. Yeah, and they actually those, yeah, they also changed their water intake as well. So they had kind of a multi-step process that they went through to make sure, and they shut down the plant for a solid amount of time as well. So
Yeah.
that's why they were kind of used as the example and walking us through kind of what they did to remediate that.
So are they gonna draw water from that again after the flow period?
They changed their source of where they were drawing the water from, and that way they were better able to.
Yeah, and they put in the granular activated part. And I would also say the CDC actually did a study like on Martinsburg, and so if you're interested in looking at kind of what they found as far as contamination from the Air National Guard base and blood levels, people's blood levels in the Martinsburg area related to drinking that contaminated water. It's a CDC study, you could probably just do the Martinsburg CDC study. Air Guard National Guard base or something, but we can include it in our research.
And the other piece I wanted to tell you is that last year during the legislative session, they passed legislation to ensure that AFFF was not being used for training purposes. So while they used to kind of use it across the board, they're now no longer using it in training, only using it in kind of heightened situations where they do not currently have another option. But the goal was also in time to have another option, because as Jenna stated at the beginning, these chemicals have been very useful, and so we understand why they have been used, and also we cannot continue. Thank you.
Just one more question, and then kind of another, point. Steve made me think, is there are different class plants, water plants, is there, in the testing, are they showing what class each plant is that you're testing?
No, I mean, I guess you'd have to dig a little deeper and, you know, take the name of the utility and then research to figure out what class it is, but they don't have that.
I didn't know if that would like affect their ability to get funding to make those upgrades.
That is an interesting question. And they weren't all plants, and some of them were elementary schools and the VA, and kind of, it just meant that they were like independent water system, public water system. So, but that's a good question that might be interesting to see how they can access what they use.
Are there any guidelines in place in other states or by the federal government that if the new corporation is going to start up a new building, a new facility, and they are going to, that they have to meet certain discharge limits before they can even get permits? Is that, do you know if that's in place? PFAS discharge.
Yeah, well, other states, yeah, so other states do have water quality criteria for PFAS that they've incorporated into their permitting processes for discharge. Not in West Virginia, and EPA, like I mentioned, we're kind of waiting for them to put out that human health criteria. So states that have taken action, they were ambitious. They're not waiting on EPA and kind of develop their own.
Probably those companies are probably coming to West Virginia.
Yeah. But the EPA has taken lots of actions on PFAS. They actually have, they call it their PFAS strategic roadmap. If you're interested in some of the more recent EPA actions, then I would encourage you to take a look at that. And they have like a very nice webpage where they kind of say exactly the actions that they've been taking in the past couple of years, including like the additions to toxic release inventory.
It's about West Virginia rivers at this point. Our legislature is in session right now. What have we proposed anything for the legislature this year?
That is a fantastic question, and we did debate whether or not it would be appropriate time for us to introduce any legislation. We were very involved in last year's passage, as I mentioned, and we are also involved in helping oversee the implementation and to make sure that this gets effectively carried out. So we did not introduce any or push for any specific legislation to this cause this year, but it is something we're continuing to kind of keep track of. We have other water policy goals that we've been trying to monitor, and our goal with that was to essentially recognize that and acknowledge that this is a ton of work. We're also a 9-person staff, so we do everything that we can to kind of make sure that this is getting effectively carried out. But that is it's something that's on our radar, and we debated doing more proposing a ban. It also is a particularly difficult climate at this time. So we went back and forth, but we did not introduce anything specific.
So
we have
down in the legislature right now, there's no change with this cause.
That's a good question. We had some really incredible champions last year that helped get this passed. So I don't want to say there are no champions, because there are people that care about these issues. And last year we had some really incredible bipartisan support across the aisle, where we had, folks really rallying for this, and particularly because they heard from people at home too. I mean, I had legislators come up to me last year who said that they voted a certain way because they heard from 400 of their constituents. So I was like, that is really working. And so there are people who are listening, and also there's kind of only so much we can do on certain topics at various times, but it's a huge priority for us, and we're kind of working it from different ways, if that makes sense.
I would also say, just to butt in.
Yeah.
Like, I think that you're being, like, modest. So I would say they have continued to champion in the avenues that are most effective. So, for example, the DEP, just because the legislature passes something, doesn't, and then expects the DEP to implement it. With all kindness to people who work at the DEP, because they are underfunded and understaffed, and very smart, caring people in a bad situation. But, you know, they are going to have a hard time implementing this in the best way possible. And so this document that West Virginia Rivers has put a lot of thought and effort into creating, this blueprint for the DEP, is critical. And so I would say that that's a massive effort of championing this work down in Charleston that is really necessary, and something very behind the scenes that is going to affect the way that DEP is able to do this work. DEP relies mostly on industry. Our organization, we do a lot of appeals through the administrative courts, trying to improve permits. And again, the excuse is we are underfunded and understaffed, and so we have to rely on industry to do the engineering and the work. And what West Virginia Rivers has done is West Virginia Rivers has stepped in and has done the work for the DEP, just like the lawyers and the engineers do on the industry side. They get paid millions of dollars a year. These ladies don't get paid millions of dollars a year, and yet they have dedicated themselves to doing that same work that those industry partners would do, partners of the DEP. They've done the NGO partner work with the DEP to provide the DEP with the work so they can take that legislation that those champions worked so hard on getting passed last year in a difficult environment, and make sure that that legislation is implemented to the best of its scope from a regulatory standpoint. And that's critical work that I don't think we should overlook. So I know. Right where it matters.
Well, we went an hour over. A very attentive and interactive audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you all. Yeah. Thank you.
And I do just want to say too, that this recording is going to go on our website on the monthly program page within the next few days, maybe a little bit sooner. If there is something that you end up deciding to share with us, like links to other resources,
Okay.
we'll put that in the same place on our monthly program page.
That's great.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I have to use that. Yeah.